Imagine waking up one morning and your government tells you, "We almost ended the world last night." Not metaphorically, not politically. Literally. 32 seconds from nuclear launch.
That actually happened. And almost.
Nobody knew about it for decades. Now here's the thing that should genuinely disturb you. The Cold War.
War, the most dangerous, expensive, and psychologically exhausting conflict in all of human history, was a war where almost no direct shot were fired between the two. Main opponents, no D-Day, no Stalingrad, no declared battlefield, and yet, 44 years of this invisible war completely reshaped every single border on the planet. It toppled
Governments. It sent men to the moon. It built the internet you are using right now to watch this video.
And in the end, one side won. Not with bombs, not with an invasion, with something far more powerful.
and far more terrifying than any weapon ever built. Today, we are going to walk through exactly how America engineered the most stunning geopolitical victory in modern history. We're going to look at the secrets they don't teach in school. The backroom deals, the psychological warfare, the economic traps, the proxy battlefields from Korea to Vietnam to Afghanistan. Because the Cold War didn't just end in 1991. Its ghost is still running the world today.
Let's begin.
May 1945. The most destructive war in human history is over. Europe is rubble. Tens of millions are dead. The old empires, British, French, German, are shattered beyond recognition, and from the ashes, two giants emerge, blinking into the sunlight. The United States of America, the Soviet Union. They had just fought together to defeat Hitler, but the moment that common enemy was gone, the alliance collapsed faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Here's why it was always going to end this way. The United States believed in free markets, individual liberty, and democratic elections. The Soviet Union believed in a one-party communist state, collective ownership, and the iron grip of the Communist Party. These were not just political disagreements. These were two completely opposite visions for what human civilization should be, and they both had nuclear weapons. That combination, total ideological incompatibility plus nuclear arsenals, created the most dangerous standoff in human history. In March 1946, Winston Churchill stood in a small town in Missouri and said something that sent chills through every Western government. He called it the Iron Curtain. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. On one side, Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, East Germany. On the other side, Western Europe, battered, broke, and desperately clinging to America for protection. And here is where the real story starts. Because in 1947, a young American diplomat named George Kennan wrote a document that would define the next 44 years of American foreign policy. It was called The Long Telegram, and its core idea was breathtaking in its simplicity. Don't fight the Soviets directly, you'll trigger nuclear war. Instead, contain them. Box them in, surround them, drain their resources, make their system collapse from within. This became known as the Containment Doctrine, and it became the master strategy that America would follow.
With stunning consistency for nearly 5 decades.
Here's something that sounds almost insane when you first hear it. In 1948, America gave $13 billion to rebuild the countries it had just helped defeat in war. Germany, Italy, France, the Netherlands, all of them received enormous American financial aid. This was called the Marshall Plan. named after Secretary of State George Marshall. And on the surface, it looked like pure generosity. But
It was one of the most brilliant geopolitical weapons ever deployed. Think about it this way. Western Europe in 1940.
1947 was starving, broken, and politically chaotic. And in chaotic, hungry countries, communism looks very attractive. The government will feed you. The government will house you. The government will take care of everything. If Western Europe fell to communism without a single shot being fired, the Soviets would control the entire Eurasian landmass from Berlin to Vladivostok. Game over. So America didn't just send soldiers. It sent money. It rebuilt factories, stabilized currencies, created jobs, made Western democracy look like it worked. And here's the brutal genius of it. The Soviets couldn't compete. Their system wasn't built for rapid consumer reconstruction. It was built for military production and ideological control. By the early 1950s, the gap between Western and Eastern Europe was already becoming visible to ordinary people. West Germans drove cars and bought refrigerators. East Germans waited in bread lines. The Marshall Plan didn't just rebuild Europe, it inoculated Western Europe against communism for a generation. That's not generosity, that's strategy. But here's where the Cold War gets very, very hot. Because while the United States and Soviet Union never fought each other directly, they fought each other everywhere else, using other countries as their battlefields, using other people's children as their soldiers. This is what historians call proxy warfare, and it is one of the darkest, most morally complex chapters of the entire Cold War. Korea, 1950. The Soviet-backed North Korean army pours across the 38th parallel in a sudden invasion. The United States, under the banner of the United Nations, sends troops to push them back. What follows is 3 years of brutal, grinding combat. American soldiers fighting Chinese soldiers because China had just gone communist in 1949 and jumped into the conflict. The war ends in a stalemate. The same border as before. 54,000 Americans dead. Over 1 million Koreans dead. And the peninsula is still divided to this day. That image says everything about the Cold War. One system created a prosperous, technologically advanced democracy. The other created a prison state so dark you can see the border from space. Vietnam was the wound that almost broke America. Starting in 1955 and escalating dramatically through the 1960s, America committed over 500,000 troops to prevent South Vietnam from falling to communist North Vietnam. The Soviets and Chinese supplied the North. America supplied the South. And ordinary Vietnamese people, millions of them, died in the crossfire of a war that was, fundamentally, about two superpowers and their competing ideologies. After nearly 20 years, 58,000 American deaths, and a social revolution that tore the country apart, America withdrew. Saigon fell in 1975. South Vietnam became communist. It looked like a massive defeat, and in the short term, it was. But in the long game of the Cold War, America was learning something crucial about the limits of military force, and those lessons would soon be turned against the Soviets. The night Sputnik launched, Americans looked up at the sky and felt genuine terror, not because a satellite was in orbit, but because if the Soviets could put that in space, they could put a nuclear warhead anywhere on Earth. The psychological impact was enormous. The Soviets appeared to be winning. They launched the first satellite. Then they sent the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit in 1961. The propaganda value was incalculable. Look, Moscow said to the entire developing world, our system produces this. Communist science just sent a man to space. President Kennedy understood exactly what was at stake. This wasn't just about rockets. It was about which system, democracy or communism deserved to lead humanity's future. What followed was the most audacious engineering project in human history. America spent what would be over $100 billion in today's money on the Apollo program. They hired the best minds. They accepted enormous risks. 3 astronauts died in a launchpad fire. They pressed on. And on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon. 500 million people watched on live television. In the Soviet Union, the government refused to broadcast it because there is no good propaganda response to the other side literally landing on the moon. The space race was about more than science. It was about convincing billions of watching humans in Africa, Asia, Latin America, which civilization they wanted to belong to. America won that argument on July 20th, 1969, and the Soviets never recovered from it psychologically. By the 1970s, the Cold War had entered a new phase. The nuclear arsenals of both sides were so massive, so apocalyptically overbuilt, that neither side could rationally use them. This was called mutually assured destruction. MAD. Literally. So the real competition shifted to economics. And here, quietly, relentlessly, the Soviet system was hemorrhaging. The command economy, where Moscow decided what every factory produced, what every farmer grew, what every store sold, was spectacularly bad at creating wealth. Innovation requires freedom to fail. The Soviet system punished failure, so people stopped trying new things. While American companies competed to make better computers, better cars, better food, Soviet factories kept producing the same tank models, the same grey apartments, the same terrible shoes. And then came 1973 and the oil shock. The Soviets got incredibly lucky. Oil prices skyrocketed, and the Soviet Union was sitting on one of the largest oil reserves on Earth. Suddenly, Soviet coffers were flooded with petrodollars. They used it to buy food on international markets because their agriculture was so broken they couldn't feed themselves. They used it to fund proxy wars. They used it to build more nuclear weapons. But it was borrowed time. Because in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan's administration, deliberately, strategically, conspired with Saudi Arabia to flood the global oil. Market oil prices collapsed, and the Soviet economy, which had become almost entirely dependent on oil revenues to survive, went into freefall. They were spending money they no longer had, on weapons they could no longer afford, to maintain an empire they could no longer control. The trap was springing shut. December 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. On the surface, it seems like a rational strategic move. Protect a communist ally, secure a southern buffer zone, project power toward the Persian Gulf. What the Soviets did not understand was that they were walking into the trap of the century, and the man who set that trap was an obscure American national security advisor named Zbigniew Brzezinski. Years later, Brzezinski would admit in a French interview what American policy had actually been. The CIA had begun funding Afghan resistance fighters before the Soviet invasion, deliberately, to provoke the invasion. The goal was simple and savage. Give the Soviets their own Vietnam, draw them into an unwinnable guerrilla war in brutal mountain terrain, bleed them dry, financially, militarily, morally. The CIA, working with Pakistan's ISI and Saudi financing, channeled billions of dollars to the Afghan Mujahideen fighters, weapons, training, intelligence, including, critically, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. Before the Stingers, Soviet helicopters owned the battlefield. After the Stingers, Soviet pilots refused to fly below 15,000 feet, making close air support nearly impossible. The entire Soviet tactical advantage was neutralized by a shoulder-fired missile. For 10 years, the Soviets bled in the Afghan mountains. Over 15,000 Soviet soldiers died. Hundreds of thousands were wounded. The financial cost was astronomical, on top of an economy already in collapse. By 1988, the Soviets had had enough. They withdrew in humiliation. And for the first time in the entire Cold War, the population of the Soviet Union began to seriously question whether the whole thing had been worth it. That question would destroy the Soviet Union. Here is one of the most underrated weapons of the entire Cold War: information. The Soviet Union built a system that controlled, completely and absolutely, what its citizens could hear, see, and believe. State television, state newspapers, state history books. But the Americans found a way through the wall. The CIA secretly funded and operated radio broadcasts, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, that beamed uncensored information behind the Iron Curtain. Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in Hungary. People risked prison sentences to listen to these broadcasts because they were hearing something they couldn't get anywhere in their own country. The truth. And simultaneously, American culture itself became a weapon. Jazz, rock and roll, blue jeans, Hollywood movies. These things seem trivial, but to a young person in East Berlin or Leningrad, a scratchy recording of Elvis Presley or a pair of Levi's was a window into another world, a world that seemed free, vibrant, alive. The Soviet government tried to ban it all. They jammed radio signals, confiscated records, arrested people for wearing Western clothing. But you cannot unring that bell. Once a generation has glimpsed freedom, however distorted, however incomplete that glimpse, they will never stop wanting it. The Cultural War was slow, it was invisible, but it was relentless. And by the 1980s, it had created an entire generation of Soviet citizens who secretly believed their own system was inferior. That is a nation that cannot long endure. March 1985. A new leader takes power in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. And unlike every leader before him, Gorbachev understood that the Soviet system was dying. He launched two historic reforms. Glasnost, openness. For the first time, Soviet media could report critically on the government. Perestroika, restructuring, attempts to reform the sclerotic Soviet economy. But here is the brutal paradox that destroyed him. The Soviet system was built entirely on the suppression of truth. The moment you allow truth, even a little truth, the entire edifice begins to shake. April 1986, Chernobyl. Nuclear reactor in Ukraine explodes. Under the old Soviet system, it would have been covered up completely. But under Glasnost, word got out. And what the world heard was devastating. Not just a nuclear accident, but a complete systemic failure. Cover-up attempts, incompetent bureaucrats, workers sent into radioactive fire with almost no protection. For ordinary Soviet citizens, Chernobyl was the proof. The system they had been told was perfect, was broken, and then the impossible happened. The countries of Eastern Europe, one by one, began to rise. Poland held free elections. Communists lost. Hungary opened its border with Austria. East Germans flooded through, and then came the night that shook the world. Not because of an army, because the people on the other side of it no longer believed in the system it represented. Gorbachev, critically, did not send tanks. In 1956 in Hungary, the Soviets had crushed revolution with tanks. In 1968 in Czechoslovakia, tanks again. But in 1989, Gorbachev let it happen. Whether from moral choice or sheer exhaustion of the Soviet system, he let the empire go. And once you give people freedom, you cannot take it back. August 19th, 1991. While Gorbachev is on vacation in Crimea, hardline communists attempt a coup. Tanks roll into Moscow. The world holds its breath. And then, the coup collapses because the soldiers refuse to fire on their own people. 3 days. That's all. It took the most powerful military machine on Earth, and when it counted, the human beings inside it chose not to pull the trigger. December 25th, 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev goes on Soviet television, the union that is already gone by the time he speaks, and resigns. The Soviet Union is dissolved. 15 new countries are born overnight. The Cold War is over. America had won. Not with a nuclear bomb, not with an invasion, with strategy, with economics, with culture, with ideas, and with the patience to play a 44-year game without blinking. But here is where the story gets truly dangerous. Because the Cold War didn't cleanly end. It left wounds. It left promises broken. It left resentments festering. When the Soviet Union collapsed, American officials, including Secretary of State James Baker, reportedly told Gorbachev that NATO would move not 1 inch eastward. That promise, disputed, never written, never formalized, was never kept. Poland joined NATO. The Czech Republic, Hungary, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, states that had been part of the Soviet Union. From Moscow's perspective, this looked like encirclement. Whether or not you sympathize with that perspective, that perception drove the next 30 years of Russian foreign policy. And then, Ukraine, the largest country in Europe by land area, excluding Russia, sits at the exact intersection of the Russian and Western worlds. It was, in many ways, the final Cold War question that was never resolved. The war in Ukraine is not simply a Russian invasion. It is, in geopolitical terms, the last chapter of the Cold War. A fight over who controls the borderlands between the Russian and the Western spheres of influence. Fight that Kennan's containment doctrine always implied would eventually have to be resolved, and China is watching all of it. Taking notes, calculating, wondering if the lesson of the Soviet Union is don't overextend your military, or don't allow your economy to become dependent on the West. The 21st century is being shaped by the unresolved tensions of the Cold War. The questions are the same. Which system produces more human flourishing? Which model of governance do the developing nations choose? Who controls the key strategic choke points, the ports, the straits, the data cables, the satellite networks? The weapons are different now. Algorithms instead of missiles. Sanctions instead of invasions. Semiconductor chips instead of steel. But the game, the old, cold, ruthless game, never stopped. So, did America win the Cold War? By most measures, yes. The Soviet Union is gone. Communism as a global organizing ideology is dead in its Soviet form. The free market system operates in virtually every country on Earth. American cultural exports, movies, music, brands, technology are everywhere. But here is the uncomfortable truth that historians argue about to this day. America won the Cold War, but then squandered the peace. Instead of helping Russia transition into a stable democracy, the West largely left it to chaos, corruption, and humiliation. Into that vacuum, Vladimir Putin stepped. Instead of building a new global order to replace the Cold War one, America launched two catastrophic land wars in the Middle East, spent $7 trillion, and came home without strategic victory. Into the space that opened, China rose. The Cold War was won. The post-Cold War was mismanaged, and now we find ourselves in something that many analysts are already calling Cold War 2.0. Different players, different weapons, different ideologies. This time, authoritarianism versus democracy, rather than communism versus capitalism. But the same fundamental question: what kind of world do we want to live in? Who gets to decide? The Cold War taught us one thing above all else. Civilizations are not won or lost on battlefields alone. They are won in economies, in laboratories, in classrooms, in the stories a society tells about itself. The side that best answers the question, why does our system deserve to survive? Is the side that will survive. America answered that question convincingly from 1947 to 1991. The question now is whether it can answer it again, because history, as always, is watching. Here is the question I want you to sit with. If the Cold War taught us that you can destroy a superpower through economic pressure, cultural influence, and strategic exhaustion, rather than direct military conflict, then is the United States, right now, vulnerable to the same strategy being used against it? And if so, who is running that playbook today? Drop your answer in the comments below. Seriously, I read every single one. And if this video made you see history differently, share it with one person who needs to understand why the world looks the way it does right now. Subscribe if you're new.